Welcome, everyone, to our first Revolutionizing Healthcare session of 2023. I'm very excited to welcome you back after a very successful last year. Today, we will talk about machine learning interpretability and also a small change to our format as we have a new collaborating session lead for our sessions, but Mihaela will talk about this in a second. So first of all, I'm happy to announce that we have a timetable for the first half of the year. We have sessions on the 16th of February, the 22nd of March, the 19th of April, 17th of May, and the 15th of June. So if you would like to already book those in, feel free to do so, but you will get emails as usual to prepare you for those sessions. For today, we have a short introduction here, and then a presentation by Mihaela. And then we will go into a roundtable discussion with our guests today, Shinjini Kundu and Eoin McKinney. And now I'd like to hand it over to Mihaela.
Thank you very much, Andreas. I would like to start with a warm welcome to our first Revolutionizing Healthcare of 2023. And I think this is an important year because I believe that 2023 is the year where machine learning is finally ready for prime time in medicine and healthcare. And I believe that this would not be possible without you, the revolutionary clinicians. We have traversed together a long journey to make these machine learning tools ready for clinical use. And we work hard together to develop these tools. And I believe that now in 2023, some of these tools are ready for prime time. So first, a very big thank you to you, the revolutionary clinicians, for your insights, for your collaboration, for your thoughts, for your engagement with us. And 2023, I think, as I mentioned, is the year to put all these different tools that are finally ready to good use. And I cannot do that, but you can. You are now in the position to use these machine learning tools to transform medicine and healthcare. So in 2023, I would like to ask you to harness these tools to improve healthcare pathways and operations. For instance, by using these machine learning tools to determine the need and predict the need for resources and better utilize resources by using these predictive models. Number two, use machine learning to improve clinical outcomes, whether it is for improved diagnosis, early diagnosis, prognosis, or better treatment. And finally, engage the wider community of clinicians, especially the young clinicians, to engage with these machine learning tools and improve them and use them to further transform healthcare. So my kind request at the beginning of this session today is to ask you, the revolutionary clinicians, to start. You may use machine learning in healthcare and take the machine learning tools as far as you possibly can and email me or other machine learning collaborators if you have challenges, and then share with us cases where you can use this successfully or insights about use of such methods. And we will organize a machine learning roundtable together with you to discuss them, such that others can learn from you and from your insights. So I'd like to imagine at the beginning of 2023, the December of 2023, so 12 months from now, and I'd like to imagine that several of you have implemented machine learning in your clinical practice, and that you can show others how these machine learning methods can be used successfully. This will be an amazing achievement and is my big hope for 2023. However, I do realize that when embarking in such journeys, you will meet colleagues and others who will not trust machine learning. So this is why I decided to start the Revolutionizing Healthcare of 2023 this year to give you the ammunition and answers to advocate for machine learning in your community. And I think a key tool to pursue and to enable such trust is machine learning interpretability. So this is why I want to start Revolutionizing Healthcare 2023 by discussing machine learning interpretability. So I will now share some of the key points and some of the key ideas associated with this. So machine learning is becoming mature, as I said, but in order to make it really actionable, we need interpretability. We know all that machine learning has the potential to become a core clinical tool. And there have been numerous advances in machine learning, but for these advances to be clinically actionable and capable of making real-world impact, the methods proposed by the machine learning community must be more than just highly predictive. I believe that interpretability is a key ingredient. And what I'm talking about here is post hoc explanations of these not transparent black box machine learning models. And as I mentioned, users need such interpretability, whether they are clinicians or anyone who uses machine learning, because they need to be able to understand and debug how models that issue predictions can be useful to enhance and further medical knowledge. And without a transparent understanding on how these models make predictions, they may act in unintended and undesirable ways. So what we want to make sure is that we provide such interpretability, not only machine learning models. So we want to be able to understand the predictions of such machine learning models and enable in this way understanding, quantification, and management of risk. Interpretability is also key because it can provide transparency. Users need to comprehend how the model makes certain predictions. This also leads to trustworthiness because users can then debug and engage through such interpretability tools, and they can debug the model based on their knowledge. Interpretability is also key because it can provide new discoveries. For instance, clinicians that are researchers can distill insights and new knowledge from the learned model. And finally, interpretability can make sure that we avoid implicit biases because the users are able to check whether the model does not learn such biases. I'd like to also say that we do not want just to interpret static or cross-sectional predictions, one-time predictions. We would like interpretability for also the more sophisticated machine learning models that we have discussed in Revolutionizing Healthcare, whether it is predictions and forecasting, clustering and phenotyping, or individualized treatment effects. Interpretability is key for all these different areas of machine learning. And indeed, more than a year ago, we have had a session with clinicians to ask them what type of insights they would like to get from these explanations. And a dialogue with clinicians was written by us as a summary of these very insightful discussions. And one important thing that came out of it was that uninterpretable models pose a threat to core medical ethics with possible detrimental consequences for both individual as well as public health. Also, others have said that understanding and debugging machine learning systems are critical steps to build model trust and is necessary for medical professionals and the broader public to engage with these machine learning models. So, in order to really go back and recap, what are the key classes of explanation methods? I would like to provide a brief recap of the key ideas as well as their definitions. So broadly speaking, we can group current methods into 5 different classes, each offering different types of explanations and having unique roles in understanding and debugging clinical models. The first one and the easiest one is feature or covariate based, where we can inspect the model predictions and we can look at what particular features or covariates were important for the model when issuing this particular prediction. For instance, is the fact that a particular patient has diabetes important for the prediction of cardiovascular risk? This could be done both at the population level as well as the individualized patient level. So we can identify what features are important for that particular patient. A second type of explanations are example-based. Instead of quantifying the relevance of each feature for the model, like in the previous case, example-based methods explain predictions by providing the clinician or the user of the machine learning model with other examples, in this case patients, often from the training set of the machine learning model, that this particular machine learning model finds as being most similar to a given particular sample. And one compelling feature of such example-based methods is that they allow the user to really customize the explanation to their expertise. So different clinicians could come to such example-based explanations and request different types of explanations on the basis of a corpus of patients that they are familiar with. For example, by changing which patients are available to the explainer, a clinician can understand these predictions of a model in terms of patients they are familiar with. A third type of explanations are concept-based explanations, which allow users to investigate these machine learning models and test whether they utilize specific concepts of interest. For instance, given a concept specified by a clinician, via, for instance, a set of examples, and these examples could be the staging of cancer, if the machine learning model is aiming at predicting a particular stage of cancer for a particular patient, a classifier is used to assess whether the internal representation of this particular machine learning model differs from examples where a concept is present from examples where a concept is absent. And these concepts can be then specified at different levels of abstraction, and they allow the user to probe the model in a very different way, since concepts are not input features of the model. So this is a very important and powerful alternative way to provide explanations. A fourth way of providing explanations is model-based explanations, which use auxiliary models, also known as meta models, to convert the black box machine learning model that's not transparent into a different form that can be used to analyze what the model has learned. One model-based method that is of particular interest is using symbolic regression, which is able to convert a black box machine learning model into an explicit closed form equation. And by doing so, we are able to achieve the same level of transparency as regressions do. We know that regressions are explicit models, explicit closed form models that often are required in many circumstances. The same thing can be achieved in terms of an explanation for a black box machine learning model by creating, using meta models, explicit equations. If we are able to do that, then we are able to elucidate the precise functional form by which model captures, for instance, nonlinearities in the data, and identifying, for instance, which features interact and how strongly. Again, we have the same level of interpretability as regressions, but with potentially nonlinear interactions between features. And after converting a machine learning model into equations, we have access to the entire range of mathematical techniques that are classically used, for instance, in regressions to analyze such models, thereby allowing deep and rigorous analysis, which is not possible for the not transparent machine learning models directly. Finally, we have counterfactuals, which, unlike example-based explanations, are typically not actual examples. They are not actual patients. However, generally it is desirable to compute and estimate counterfactuals to be plausible patients. And to construct such counterfactuals, the user often only needs to be able to query the system and receive an explanation in the form of a counterfactual. Generating such counterfactuals is complex. It's a multi-objective optimization problem that does depend on the user's preferences. And one needs to realize that such counterfactual explanations are often not unique. And generating multiple counterfactual explanations often provides additional insights into the model behavior by uncovering multiple viable ways of altering the original example to achieve a different prediction. However, this lack of uniqueness can also be a downside, since a feature being unaffected does not mean necessarily that changing its value would not alter the prediction. But in general, counterfactuals can be viewed as causing a model's prediction. And by interpreting these features as causing this model prediction, then counterfactual explanations can be seen as causal for the model, even if they are not necessarily true counterfactuals for the underlying joint distribution. And as a result, the interpretation of counterfactual is clear, and they can be useful in scenarios where it is possible to modify the underlying features, for instance, by intervening on the specific patient's features. Now, let us look at how we can use such interpretations by different stakeholders. For instance, clinicians can ask questions such as, what features or covariates does the model use to issue its prediction for a specific patient? Or what previous patients is the patient in front of the clinician similar to in the mind of the machine learning model? If a patient is there, the clinician may want to use such machine learning explainability to ask questions such as, what can I change to alter the prediction for you, the patient in front of me? What features, for instance, I could intervene on? On the other hand, we can take a different view. We can use explainability when we develop models. And we can, for instance, use them for debugging. We want to understand established medical concepts or not. Do the feature used by the model make sense or not? On the other hand, if the person engaging with the machine learning model and the explanation is a medical researcher, one may want to know what are the relationships between the features as identified by the model, and what is the impact, again, of changing particular features. Finally, as regulators are engaging with machine learning models, one can wonder whether explicit equations could be used instead of the machine learning model. So by using meta models, we can create white box models that can enable explicit equations that could be provided instead and can be used instead of the not transparent machine learning model. If you are interested to engage more with these resources, I realize I went very fast over these different concepts. We have a set of resources that you can, where you can go to, and you can read more about these different types of interpretability methods and engage with them. Also, based on our former discussion with clinicians, we understood that the key impediment to adoption is a lack of readily available, easy-to-use implementation of methods to explain machine learning models. And this is why we created an open source package containing a suite of interpretability methods, and where you can come and go through the different cases and understand what type of explainability may be right for you, depending on your own interest of engaging and understanding or debugging this particular machine learning model. You also see numerous resources from a variety of researchers engaged in machine learning interpretability in our group, but also outside our group. And finally, you can direct the data scientist working with you to our GitHub, where software is available that you can use to understand and interpret machine learning models of all sorts that you may have interest to use in your clinical practice. We also developed a visualization platform, making a range of explanation readily accessible to the medical community. And we hope that this will facilitate the interaction between the machine learning community that develops models and you, the clinical community. And today we have brought together two esteemed clinicians who have thought a lot about interpretability methods and have engaged a lot with developing cutting-edge interpretability methods. And we invited them to discuss how to use such machine learning interactions. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce Andrew Rashbas, who is the former CEO of the Economist Group and Reuters, as well as Euromoney. And Andrew has studied also artificial intelligence and machine learning at some point, and he has kept a passion for this area over the years. And a few months back, he and I have started to collaborate on machine learning and a variety of machine learning projects, inclusively machine learning for healthcare. And I'm absolutely delighted that the collaboration is going extremely well. So Andrew has joined us as an honorary member of our lab, and we are now working very closely together on numerous research projects and initiatives, inclusively revolutionizing healthcare. So Andrew, I'm unbelievably delighted to have you on board, and now I will hand over to you to chair the panel.
Thanks, Mihaela. I'm delighted and very honored to be working with your amazing lab. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining. We are on Zoom, obviously, and I'm sure many of you use Zoom for lots of things. At the bottom, you have the chat function. Do please, making the question available to everybody, do please put your questions into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on those questions that come in from you as we go. As well as Mihaela, though, we have two great experts that we're very privileged to have with us, Professor Eoin McKinney and Dr Shinjini Kundu. What I'd like to do is just to ask Eoin and Shinjini to put their cameras on so that you can see them. And then what I'd like to do is to ask them just to introduce themselves rather than me mangling my way through their CVs. Because and what I'd like them to, I'm going to ask them to bring out particularly is their machine learning and their clinical practice and interests, so that I'm sure they're very well known to a lot of you, but I'm sure there are some of you who are not aware of exactly how they operate both within the machine learning world and of course in their clinical practice. So Eoin, maybe we can start with you. Can you help your colleagues here on the call to just understand kind of where you're coming from a clinical and machine learning point of view?
Sure. I mean, my clinical context is really in inflammatory diseases. So autoinflammatory diseases that are extremely heterogeneous. We've got a lot of pretty good treatments for those, but nonetheless, they're particularly toxic, and then they suppress your immune system, and consequently, there are careful risk-benefit balances for using those treatments. Consequently, we'd like to know exactly who needs them, what the benefits are, and to quantify those benefits better and to offset them with the risks so we can make individual treatment decisions, because clearly the risks and benefits really matter and they are very different depending on the patient context. So that's a really, really ripe context in which to bring the sort of powerful ML tools that can improve prediction that Mihaela has been talking about. And with respect to this discussion, I don't think any of those predictive models would be. I don't think it would be feasible to deploy any of them unless they are interpretable, and I think that's becoming increasingly the case. So interpretability for me, from a pragmatic perspective of models that can be used, is an absolute must. And from an interest perspective, clearly it's massively preferable as well.
Thanks, Eoin. And Shinjini, do share with us your clinical context and machine learning.
Sure, absolutely. First, I wanted to thank Mihaela for that kind of overview on different explainability methods. And I think really highlighting that there's no one way to do it. But the fact that we need to do it is there. Now, a little bit about my background. I'm an MD, PhD. From the MD perspective, I'm a practicing radiologist. So I'm a radiology resident at Johns Hopkins currently. And before I became a medical doctor, I came from a background of electrical engineering and computer science. So I earned my bachelor's and master's in electrical engineering, and then did my PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, focusing on machine learning and the intersection of machine learning with medical imaging and medical image processing. And in particular, one of the areas of interest that I had, it wasn't called explainable AI at that time, but essentially that's what it was. Trying to figure out how we can actually visualize and understand what these AI methods and machine learning methods are using to make their decisions. And the reason for that was several-fold. First of all, the projects that I was interested in at the time was we're trying to find latent signs of disease from medical images that humans could not detect easily. So we're trying to find, basically exceed the human capacity to make diagnoses or kind of extend it using machine learning. And so for that, it would be very helpful for a human to actually be able to understand what the machine is seeing that the human is not seeing, both from a scientific point of view to understand kind of what these scientific mechanisms are of disease, but also from a trust point of view, and to figure out, well, what do we do about it now? So I think that was kind of the motivation for explainability. And I think that as time has gone on, I've found that, I think I've only kind of found that the view that clinicians kind of want explainability has been reinforced, and that has been reinforced through different research studies in different areas of medicine and different areas of kind of radiology, extending from like osteoarthritis detection, which was one of my projects, detecting osteoarthritis 3 years before any symptoms developed in asymptomatic patients, all the way to, you know, trying to understand brain aging and seeing what the effect of different factors are, lifestyle factors like exercise, and how that can kind of protect the kind of neural health. I think that at the end of the day, physicians want to know why these machine learning methods are making the decisions they're making, because there's a follow-up step, hopefully, that will come after that.
That's great, Shinjini. You both brought out, and Mihaela as well, of course, the kind of essential nature of interpretation or interpretability. Oh, and is it a kind of, might be a long time, but a temporary thing while the clinicians build trust in models that being right is not enough? And it's, well, how would I know? But once kind of machine learning, and maybe that's 5 years, once it's got to a place where actually it is trusted, two parts to the question. One, does interpretability become so important? But secondly, if there is, as I suspect the literature says, that there may be a trade-off between accuracy and interpretability, when it gets to a stage where, in order to have what you're both saying, and Mihaela as well, we must be able to interpret, is actually making the machine learning less accurate, potentially therefore less useful, and potentially over time clinicians and patients are trusting it more. Is this a temporary phase we're in that might ultimately not be necessary down the line? Owen, do you have a view on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I'm not quite sure I buy into the idea that interpretability and accuracy need be opposing weights on a scale. I don't think they can be. I think we need to have accuracy alongside interpretability, and one shouldn't be traded for the other. They have to go hand in hand. So that's a challenge, but so with regards to whether this is a phase that we have to get through to install trust in AI or ML systems that we can go past and forget about interpretability, I don't think so. But perhaps to answer that properly, I need to take a step back and consider what we mean by interpretability, because particularly clinicians or biologists mean different things. On one hand, interpretability can mean what the model is picking out, what features it deems important. And that's one level of interpretability, which is unquestionably important. The second level of interpretability becomes a little more subjective, which is why those features are important. And that was alluded to a second ago with regards to trying to unpick the mechanism of a particular biological process. If you can find a model that's predictive, can I understand why it's predictive? Learn something about the mechanisms of the disease. Now you need to go to both of those steps to do that. You need to understand what features are being built into the model and being used, but then you need to impose a biological or clinical interpretation upon that to do the second part. Both those parts are important. The first bit I don't think is a fad, and perhaps the best example I can give you why is from some previous work that's looked at what's called alarm fatigue. So if you build a model that's going to be a clinical alert system, let's say as a simplistic example, and it's going to alert every time something happens or something's going to happen, it's very clear that when you deploy that, people simply stop responding to it. So you're telling me that this patient in front of me is completely well, is going to experience a disaster in the next 3 days. Well, if you repeatedly tell me this as we move up towards this impending disaster, unless you can convince me of why that's the case, if I look at them and they look fine, clinicians don't respond to that information. They have to understand and be led to why that's the case before that can become actionable. So I think that's a natural human trait that is inherently reliant upon interpretability. So I don't think for that reason it'll go away. It's increasingly being baked into regulations as well. If you want to deploy a system, your model has to be quote unquote interpretable. And that's part of GDPR regulations now. It's less clear what that actually means in practice. In other words, how should it be interpretable? What by what definition of interpretability? That's less clear, but it's clear that this is increasingly important to actually get yourself past regulatory hurdles as well. So for several reasons, I don't think it's going away. And I suppose to come back to the interesting point you made, I hope and don't think it's a trade-off necessarily with accuracy.
Could I jump on that, Andrew? Am I allowed?
Before you do that, Mihaela, I was going to come to you actually, but I just want to add an extra sort of to bring in Shinjini's point. Shinjini said that it's important that the part of interpretability is to find out what they are using to make the decisions. But is it not the case that potentially the interpretation, whilst true, is not necessarily the same way in which the machine made its prediction? So again, that opens up the gap for potentially a mismatch between the accuracy of the prediction and that's why, Owen, potentially you might have a disconnect between those two. So now, having framed the question, give us the answer.
Well, I think Shinjini has talked also a tremendous amount of time about this question. So I think her answer, I'd be keen to hear her answer. But my answer is, first, I'd like to differentiate between methods that are interpretable by design. Regressions are, decision trees potentially are. There are blends of those that combine the two. Even ourselves in the beginning of our journey in machine learning for healthcare 8 years ago, we built these hybrids, which were in between regressions and decision trees, partially to keep the models interpretable. And if you go that route, I would dare say you will sacrifice, in some cases, not always. This is where the AutoML perspective comes, that picks up the best model for a particular data set. But in sufficiently many cases, methods that are interpretable by design, like regressions or other such models, may suffer in terms of performance. So if you go that route, your point, Andrew, is well taken. But what we're discussing here is post hoc interpretability, where we take a machine learning model that's not transparent, we do not sacrifice its performance, but we try to interrogate it with these different interpretability lenses and pose all these questions in an overall goal of really understanding it. And finally, maybe this whole meta models idea, where you take a machine learning model and you replace this not transparent model to a model that closely approximates it, could be potentially yet another way of thinking about sacrificing maybe some performance, but that model is created on the basis of the not transparent model and guided by it. rather than completely by design.
That's interesting. So Shinjini, when you listen to that and you look at the essential nature for you in your clinical practice of the interpretability, how do you think about this trade-off that Mihaela is talking about between the post hoc, where you kind of got the answer and now you have to understand it, and building it into the design of the model in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I kind of want to agree with Eoin and Mihaela that you don't necessarily need to sacrifice accuracy for interpretability. That's not necessarily the case. Now, there are two different kind of ways to think about interpretability. And like Mihaela was saying, you can bake it into the model itself. Like it's inherently just explainable the way it works. Or it could be kind of a black box, and then you try to fit another model on the first model to explain it. And that's what we have to understand, is that in practice today, the vast majority of explainability methods are post hoc, which means you're fitting a model on another model that's not explainable in the first place. So you're not directly getting at the causes in that case, right? You're just kind of modeling another model and trying to glean something from it, but it may not be causal to your outputs. Now, some of the research that I've done has focused on inherent explainability, that the model itself is just explainable, like you can understand the model. And I do think that is, if it's possible, it's better. But the fact is that it's not always that easy to develop models like that. And I think for me, in my case, it was kind of the result of an entire PhD to come up with, a prototype of something like that. So it's not easy. Now, so that's kind of my view on inherent versus post hoc. I think inherent is always better. Now, if you do have kind of post hoc explainability, I do think that one of the things that clinicians need to understand, I think it needs to be task specific. So I think the explainability needs to give the information that the clinician cares about. So the clinician needs to understand that this may not be exactly how the machine arrived at its decision, but it's giving me something that I can potentially use in my clinical practice. And that's actually actionable. So that's kind of the way the clinician needs to think about it. And to kind of wrap up the answer to this question, I just wanted to leave one kind of point that's food for thought. If you think about the purported trade-off between accuracy and interpretability, if you have a completely explainable model that is picking up on reliable medical pathology, why wouldn't that model be more accurate, right? Like, if it's so complicated that it's looking at like all sorts of different things, you don't know how the sausage is made, but there's so much in it. Why is that necessarily better by default, right? Like if you can explain it pretty simply and there's a medical reason, why wouldn't that be better? And so I think that that's kind of where we're at with the accuracy versus interpretability.
I think it's a great answer, Shinjini. I guess, and this is a kind of conversation it's kind of our dirty washing in public, but this is the kind of conversation that Mihaela and I regularly have. That the reality is, it might, I guess, be the fact that all 100 variables are relevant to the outcome, and yet we're forcing the machine to say yes, but which of the three? Because we humans deal with three, and in fact we can't get our heads around the fact that it might be 100 things. So there might, I guess, be a reason why it is inherently, I don't know, uninterpretable, but inherently difficult to understand. But I think there's really a sort of follow on from that is a question that's come in, and I'm going to ask Thomas Daniels to unmute himself and ask his question. And the reason why I think this question is in, because it's, if I understand you correctly, Thomas, what your question gets to this point that, well, maybe actually, rather than saying the human side is sacrosanct and the humans have to carry on being as they are, actually maybe in the light of the opportunities, maybe humans can become better because of the opportunities of machine learning. That seems to me to be at the crux of your question. So Thomas, do ask your question, because I think it really is a very interesting counter to, I guess, Eoin's point about alarms. So Thomas.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for the interesting discussion. Yeah, so I guess I wouldn't disagree with Owen. I think that alarm fatigue is a really big issue. But I see the opportunity for machine learning to improve the accuracy of these algorithms. And it's, in reality, we're already using algorithms full stop. Very simple ones that are generally inaccurate. And machine learning has the opportunity to make those significantly more accurate and reduce, therefore, the false alarm rate, and therefore, hopefully, reduce the alarm fatigue issue. But alarm fatigue is an issue across all safety critical industries. And there's a huge science that goes on beyond the machine learning community around that. And I think it's beholden on all scientists to engage with people outside of their expertise bubble, so psychologists and human factors specialists, to improve the whole pathway through this. Machine learning is just one chunk in a whole chain from patient bedside, through the data, through the algorithm, and out the other side into human responses to that. And I think we need to be working together across that whole chain in order to make full use out of the fantastic power of machine learning. So I guess, sorry, that isn't a question actually, but I guess how do we do that? How do we foster those links, and how do we build that whole chain through from start to finish, so that the system can really be made to function better? If that's a question.
That's a great question, but I think the first bit is a question as well. So I guess Thomas starts by saying, does machine learning have the power actually to solve alarm fatigue through making it accurate, so when it goes, it's nearly always a problem? And secondly, if it has this opportunity, how do you make that real in a clinical or indeed other emergency? But we're dealing here with clinical settings, so in a clinical setting. So Owen, how do you think about the opportunity for improving the whole alarm fatigue situation?
Yeah, firstly, I completely agree with Thomas. It's a complex problem that starts at a beginning and the end, and the increasing accuracy is unquestionably perhaps the best way of mitigating it, because that will reinforce its message and make people take note of it the second time. I guess the question here is whether interpretability can significantly contribute to reducing that fatigue. And certainly if I suspect this extends well beyond clinical practice, but if someone can understand why they're being alerted, or why the result they're acting on is giving that alarm, then they're much more likely to respond to it and engage with that information. So I think that's where machine learning, unquestionably by accuracy, can help, but specifically for interpretability, I think that can be an important contribution there too.
Andrew, do you allow me to jump one more time, just for one second?
Absolutely, of course.
Because Anne and Tom talked about something very important and dear to my heart, because this is how I got into machine learning for healthcare, by looking at alarms in the hospital, and I hope to continue to work with them on this journey. It's not only accuracy, it's precision recall. I think that's part of the problem. People always tested these methods, and they don't look at the amount of false alarms, and people just focus on accuracy. But 99% nothing happens. Everything in the model is highly accurate, but it is by looking at other metrics of performance, such as precision recall, and I'm not going to get into deep definitions here, but trying really to come up with these additional measures that tell also how many times we inaccurately measure this alarm, and ask the machine learning community to report to you this type of additional metrics of performance besides accuracy, and finally trustworthiness in terms of uncertainty estimates.
It is interesting though, but it is very dependent on Owen being right that there is no trade-off. Because if there were a trade-off, then Thomas is kind of proposing a different route, which is, look, make it hyper accurate, and then that'll solve the fatigue. And if you had to, Owen is saying, well, let's not get to the place where we have to make that choice. So let's hope that that turns out technically to be true.
I know there are some very clear examples where that choice has been made, where people have chosen perhaps what are simplistic models, regression models, because they are more interpretable, and they've shied away from the other other more complex models like network-based models. However, I think the sorts of approaches that Mihaela has described, the sorts of models upon models to facilitate understanding and picking out those features, I think that has changed now. And I don't think there's an enforced or necessary selection between the simple or the more complex models on the basis of interpretability alone.
But I think please, Judy.
Well, I think this kind of issue is kind of gets at the fact of not thinking of the machine learning model as a, in isolation, but thinking of the system, right? Because I know that there's been a lot of kind of debate on whether AI is better than doctors. And there's been, a lot of opinions on both sides. But I think that's kind of the wrong question, right? The right question is a human plus AI better than a human alone in practicing medicine? Because ultimately, if the AI doesn't help the doctor do a better job at taking care of patients more efficiently and kind of increasing the scale of the care that doctor can provide, then it may not necessarily be helpful to the goals of that practice. And I think that to ensure that, we need to kind of start testing these machine learning models early on. So rather than going through a whole cycle of development and then putting it out there, and then realizing that there's this issue of alarm fatigue, or that, it's not really interfacing with the way that doctors really practice medicine. I think we need to kind of do the opposite approach. Ask doctors first, like, what would they want to see in their practice? Like what are they looking for? What would help the most? And how would they like to interface with the AI? Do they want something that makes autonomous decisions for a very simple task that's like maybe well-defined and they don't want to think about it? Or do they want a system where it kind of makes a little bit, more complex decisions and then it's fully interpretable, and then the doctor can use the input? Like, I think there are a lot of different possibilities, but we need to ask the doctor first what would help, and then kind of work backwards and create a system that kind of has those outputs. And we've seen like precedent for this type of work because, the way that planes are flown, and back in the day, there used to be a pilot and they called it stick and rudder flying, where the pilot just flew the plane manually. And now there are different components that are automated and the pilot doesn't have to, go through the nitty gritty of how that works. But the pilot has to understand how to interface with those components and how to kind of troubleshoot if anything goes wrong. So they're kind of overseeing a lot of different automated components. And that has actually made flying, it's made the job different, but it's also made it safer in some ways, because it's taken out the element of human error in some of the aspects of flying. So I think we can use that analogy.
I think it's a great, you move us on very helpfully, Shinjini, towards, what makes it real, what makes it implementable. From my experience, it's always quite difficult with transformational technology to say to people who've never used that technology, what do you want from this transformational technology? Because their context doesn't really include the transformational technology. But I do agree with you that there must be a way to find a halfway house. But I think we have a question here, and I'm going to ask Nazima to unmute and ask her question. And if you could just say who you are and what your institution is, because I think your question really gets to this, it really gets to the crux of how do we move to the next stage of implementation. Nazima.
Thank you. What you said just now, Shinjini, I think that particularly addressed a lot of what I think. I completely agree with all of that. I'm an pediatric intensive care doctor. I'm based at Cambridge. And so my question is in relation to rapidly changing high stakes situations where actually there's a lot of potential because particularly in the NHS in England, we have out of hours care, often with trainees who might actually benefit from such models better. But the issue is how we can develop models that they can trust, because the decision needs to be made quickly and accurately. And a lot of them still want to use their gut feeling. However, I think there's so much data there that are sort of addressing key questions using the time series data that's already within our systems. There's so much data there, and working in collaboration is really important with that focus on, I think, the low-hanging fruit of what you think would make a difference clinically. But it's the out of hours that worries me, isn't it? And that's where I think we could really make a difference, where senior clinicians are not on site with better gut feeling?
I think it's a great question and a great challenge, because and it's a point that Mihaela was making about all of this will depend an enormous amount upon whom you're talking to. And I think you create, rather than saying all clinicians are the same, actually you're creating a difference between, you know, that first year and the experienced consultant. So who has
Andrew, can I jump for 1 second more?
Yeah.
Would you allow me to jump one more time?
Please.
So I'm very inspired by what both Shinjini and Nazima said, because I think that these are great challenges for the machine learning community, because this is not just human-machine interaction, which we understand quite well, is understanding how these combinations of human and computer can interact, and that requires quite a lot of new machine learning. So I think that it's very interesting because they kind of throw to us, the machine learners, a very big challenge on trying to understand trustworthiness in both sides and potentially use machine learning to both monitor the younger clinicians who may be left alone, and if something is happening that doesn't look right to the machine, maybe the machine learning model can flag the responsible clinician, the more senior clinician with that. And sorry, recently we have looked quite a lot at something along these lines, which we call online mediation, which is kind of a new type of machine learning thinking, which allows humans and machine to interact. That's one of the many ways. But this online mediation is a little bit of what both Shinjini and Nazima highlighted. And I think that's super exciting as a machine learner.
But I also think that there is a very practical thing here that Nazima was asking. I don't know, Eoin, whether, you know, from a clinical perspective, you have which is, it's out of hours. There is no senior clinician there. Surely these systems have an enormous value for the doctor who doesn't have a senior clinician to turn to. Does that change the I don't know, something about the priority of implementation or the complexity or the accuracy or anything else that's required?
Well, I think it does, but I think the bit I would focus on from what Nazima said was that what we rely on is gut, right? We rely on an instinct, and that instinct is essentially an ironically uninterpreted distillation of experience, right? That is what we have gained. Our gut tells us what we hope is the right answer because we've spent many years developing that gut. However, the instantial explanations that Mihaela was referring to earlier, so not the feature-based interpretability, but the instantial explanations where you'll have a case and you may be able to interpret that case in the form of a corpus where there are many other similar cases. That's clinical experience. There's a few better descriptions of clinical experience than that alone. So being able to, perhaps, if we take your example out of ours, take the difficult case where you're not quite sure what to do. If I could give a junior that instantial case and give them all of the other cases or the most similar cases that were experienced in a corpus, and the corpus could be national, it could be internet, it could be huge, that could show you the clinical trajectory, and then obviously you can extend that into individual treatment effects and how that course was modified. But even just placing one case in the context of many other similar cases could give you clinical experience on tap. And I think, as we know as clinicians, even if you're senior, rarer cases, no one has sufficient experience of. So I think going beyond what we refer to as gut instinct or clinical experience and formalizing that can be extremely helpful. And that's clinical decision support. It's providing a context of evidence rather than formally saying, if you see this, do this. And consequently, it's perhaps more easily implementable.
And it's very much in line with Shinjini's point about being a collaboration and Mihaela's point. Indeed. But I see that, Alexander, you've got a follow-on for this. I've just jumped over a question which I'll come back to, but Alexander, because your point is so relevant to this part of the conversation, do you want to unmute yourself, because you're talking here absolutely about what Eoin was talking about the relationship between machine learning and gut?
Yeah, so I think that a dimension, well, Eoin touched on it, that we need to include, obviously, is that having interpretable decisions are a crucial part of decision support tools. So if a predictive model comes to one conclusion and the gut reaction of the clinician feels something different, what you should be able to do by examining counterfactual outcomes is explain to them, yeah, we understand your decision, but be aware that our models would predict that if you did this, the outcome would be that, and the reason for the outcome being that would be, and then you can give the drivers of that outcome. And that would help explain people, to give them a sense check of where their initial decision might lead. I have to say, I think it's slightly pejorative. I know we do it all the time to refer these as gut reactions. I think, this is to do with the whole issue of how clinicians make decisions. And I think there's been lots and lots written about this. I mean, we all make decisions, both in the old terminology of thinking slow and thinking fast. There may be some intuitive heuristics which we use initially, and then we try to sometimes retrofit that heuristic to what our interpretation of the data is. These models may help us explain some of our why we're coming to the decision that we've come to.
And I just wanted to kind of bring in one more point. While I do agree that experienced clinicians, oftentimes they do make snap judgments based on gut. But the thing is that to develop that gut, it required a lot of years of studying, textbooks, as well as seeing patients. And so it's not kind of an arbitrary gut decision as in, maybe some other fields where AI is making inroads, like making recommendations for Netflix movies. Like, it's not a gut level decision to that level. It's still based on medical pathology. And at the same time, doctors still have to explain their decisions to a lot of different stakeholders. For example, they have to quantify their reasoning in a note for other doctors to understand why they're doing what they're doing. They have to explain it to the patient and the patient's family to reach a shared collaborative decision making. They have to teach junior trainees, why they came up with that. Otherwise, the junior trainee would not be able to. And while you could argue that if you think about explainability and the frameworks that kind of Mihaela was talking about, you could explain through counterfactuals, you can explain through instance-based, that, oh yeah, I saw a patient last week who had this, and this is what happened. This is why I'm doing this, I'm treating this patient this way. Or you could say that, oh no, but if the patient had this, then I would be treating the patient this way. But because the patient doesn't have that, I'm treating the patient this way. So I think doctors do a kind of put on, explainability in a way that kind of mirrors what Mihaela was saying, that there are different ways of explainability. And so I do think that ultimately explainability is needed for medical education as well of young trainees. And I think it kind of does get at the point that some of that explainability is post hoc, maybe in some ways. The doctor made a gut decision, and then the trainee asks why. And you may not be able to quantify exactly the formula that went on in your brain, but you can explain it in some way to the trainee. So I think that the biggest difference, to summarize, between medicine and other areas of artificial intelligence is that medicine does still depend on that domain knowledge. There is a scientific basis, and there may be a gut decision, but needs to be aligned with a scientific basis. And that's really why we need to make sure that the models are learning that scientific basis and can communicate that.
And to jump in, because one other passion of mine is machine learning for education. It seems to me that maybe rather than using machine learning to just kind of replace the decision of the clinician, what you are saying, Shinjini, is maybe building machine learning models that can help educate the young clinicians to build this gut feeling faster by maybe showing to them all sorts of complex cases and perturbations of the current case, to almost probe the knowledge of the clinician and accelerate their knowledge by showing more complex cases that are maybe not so trivial.
Yeah, absolutely. Through different ways of explainability, counterfactual examples, you can absolutely try to accelerate that process of developing that intuition.
I think we have time just for one more question that's on the chat from Henk. And Henk, perhaps you can, I'm sure people know who you are, but just to give your background and practice, because I think your question sort of takes these questions about the limits of learning, but also of interpretation, and also the importance of it, I think expresses it very well. So Hank, do you want to unmute yourself and tell us your question, if you're still with us? Hi. So let me read.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm not on the video because the host stopped. So I'm sorry.
Don't worry.
I'm from Holland, and I used to be a professor in general practice. Retired now for more than a year, and I'm very interested in machine learning. As we did some research a few years ago on the prediction of cancer with the help of notes of general practitioners. And what I was trying to explain is that as a GP, we are always acting in an environment of small chances. I mean, if a patient has a 3% chance of a disease, we call it a very high possibility that the patient in question is ill. So most of the time, if a machine helps me predicting the presence of disease, the machine will be wrong. If you have a chance of 3%, the machine will be wrong. And if he says 30 times yes, 29 times he will be wrong. And that will be the actual practice, I think. And if we want to act upon such a small chance, we have to come up with a good story to motivate patients to do what we ask them to do. So I think that is one of the reasons why machine learning should be explainable. The results should be explainable for each patient separately. And that's also the power of machine learning, because I'm not so fond of the gut feelings, because I don't believe anything of gut feeling, to be honest. I think gut feeling is nothing more than a bad organized machine learning algorithm, and a very bad organized. I mean, and it comes with being long in practice. And if you ask a doctor who says he has a gut feeling, he can, most of the time, he can really good explain why he has a gut feeling. So I think it doesn't make so much difference, the gut feelings and the machine learning. And so that was my contribution from a long time in being in practice.
Thank you. I mean, it's very powerful. I don't know whether anyone on the panel, I just think this idea that says that actually, you know, I guess it's about two questions. One is, do you think that machine learning, before it gets interpreted, is going to improve from Hank's 3%, I suppose, you know, in generally, is that the promise of machine learning partly, which helps solve the problem? But secondly, how does one cope with the fact that if it is still 3%, you know, do you agree that with Hank that critical is going to make this interpretability even more important? Mihaela.
If you allow me, Andrew, yeah, I think Hank is again puts a very interesting and important challenge, and a little bit what Shinjini said, I think, is also related to this, because in these very complex cases, because when is machine learning interesting? When the patient is complex. If we could add to those very few complex cases at this particular complex moment in time, when really we do not know, the clinician doesn't know for sure. I think that these are very interesting cases, and that's when it would be wonderful if the machine learning model can provide, as Hank rightly says, sufficient alternatives to machine learning interpretability, similar cases, concepts that may have been useful, counterfactuals, to try to really push the clinician to think and debug further this particular patient and take new things into consideration. And potentially, through the example-based explanation and the corpus, as Eoin was saying, maybe even say, well, there may be other people that may have seen such patients with this characteristic that may know better. So I feel that machine learning can, especially in these cases when the clinician is not very sure, have a discussion partner, not somebody that decides instead of them, but somebody that can help them go through their own thinking to understand alternatives. I think that will be very interesting, and that goes back to what both Shinjini and Nazima were saying, this cooperation in the hard cases. Because often we think about the boring cases where both the human and the machine know equally well what will happen to this person. I think the interesting case is, and Hank's challenge, I think, is very exciting. What happens in those very few cases when the human doesn't know? Can the machine help the human? The machine may not know for sure either. Can they collaborate to come up with the right answer? And in radiology, a few years back, we wrote a publication for radiology where we showed that this may be the case, that at times the radiologist doesn't know. Certain cases are difficult for the radiologist, some are difficult for the machine, but through the combination, they can solve some of the really hard cases together because the machine is pointing out interesting things which the clinician can then interpret and say, you made me aware of something. And I think that is interesting, especially in time series settings, where there is a lot of longitudinal data that needs to be integrated by the clinician, and hence the machine can point out interesting points that may find. So I'm quite excited.
That is, I agree. Look, we're very, very nearly out of time, and there are 3 fascinating questions in the chat. So they're kind of observations as much as questions. So I would encourage everyone who's on the call just to look at the chat, and I think there's now 4 of those. So do have a look at that. I just wanted, as we wrapped in the final minute, just to ask our 2 guest panelists in Eoin and Shinjini to go back to Mihaela's kind of opening remarks on 2023 being ML ready for prime time. You're both clinicians and ML pioneers. You're speaking here to a group of clinicians, all of whom have signed up to this future, but perhaps are looking for how to make it a reality in their practice. If you gave them one thing to take away, it might be a learning thing, it might be a doing thing, it might be a speaking to someone thing. What would you advise them to take Mihaela's words of and plea about let's make 23 the year that ML goes prime time in medicine? What would be your thoughts? Shinjini, do you have something you would say to your colleagues on this call?
Yeah, I think to kind of abstract a lot of the points, and I know that there have been a lot of questions in the chat, and a lot of people didn't like the idea of gut feeling, and there's a lot of discussion about randomized control trials. I mean, of course, we want to practice evidence-based medicine, right? And what does that mean? Ultimately, the big picture here is that we want to make sure that both our doctors and our AI models are practicing based off of medical pathology and their understanding of the medical process, not necessarily, other types of factors. And I think that gets at the idea of generalizability. If you have an algorithm that produces very accurate results on the testing and the training set, it may not even matter in the context of a patient. If it's not using a medically causal explanation, if it's not using medical pathology to make its decisions, things that are accepted to be science, it may not even matter in the context of a patient. And I would argue the same thing for a doctor too. I mean, obviously, if you can't explain your reasoning in terms of science and in terms of medical causation, then I think that, of course, that input is less valuable. So for example, if a patient presents and they have a cough, you want to know why they have it. Is it pneumonia? Is it, is it COVID? Is it like TB? Do they have lung cancer? Or do they, right? Like these are all medical causes of a person's illness. And that's essentially what doctors are trying to find. And our AI model should also be helping doctors find that. And it's not necessarily about accuracy. It's not about explaining the data. It's not about models. It's not about, explainability methods. It's about, are doctors able to really get at the heart of why the patient is sick? And is AI also able to help doctors get at the heart of why the patient is sick? And I think that's really what it's about.
So you answered my challenge with a challenge back to Mihaela, really, which is fantastic because Mihaela loves a challenge. What's your answer to Mihaela's challenge to us about the community, the clinical community, about let's make 23 the year of prime time?
I think definitely give feedback. Give your feedback to if the AI is useful and if it's actually picking up on things that are medically relevant in patient care.
That's very powerful.
Because that's the only way it's going to improve.
Owen.
I can make mine brief. I think that the only way this works, and it's been highlighted already, is not through some sort of dictatorial approach by machine learning telling clinicians what to do. It's about interaction. And I think if Mihaela's vision of 2023 is going to come true, it's going to require interaction. Difficulty is that everyone on this call is already interacting, and that's the key bit that's necessary. So I think everyone here has to become advocates and get out there and get the people who aren't on this call to join the conversation, because that's the only way it's going to be implementable. What we're talking about is evidence-based medicine. What we're really talking about here is changing what we consider to be evidence. There's a lot more evidence than we could use than we currently do. Everyone advocates evidence-based medicine, but I think the way we base it, the evidence we found it on, is deeply flawed and could be a lot better. And hopefully by the end of 2023, it will be.
Eoin, thank you. Shinjini, Eoin, Mihaela, thank you very much. It's been a fantastic conversation, and very much looking forward already to the next one of these. And Andreas put up the calendar, so that's already out there, I hope. And I look forward to seeing you all at that one. Thanks very much for coming along today.